Shabbat Shalom. I hope you'll excuse me. I have two tangents this morning besides my main topic. So I'm stating it now so that you know. In our class on Friday, as we were discussing the Gemara, people wondered, why is the Gemara going off in these strange directions? It has nothing to do with the main topic. And so that's the Gemara. That's Jewish learning. Tangents are the essence. So I'm going to start with one and I'm going to end with one. And then have the main sermon in the middle. So again, Shabbat Shalom. It's great to see everyone as we enter our post-Hanukkah period, and a very slow period in Judaism till Tu B'Shvat, and then moving on till Purim and Pesach and the rest of the year. Now, my tangent has to do with the first one, has to do with the Parsha this morning. In the Parsha, we read of a meal that's had between the Egyptians and Joseph and his brothers. And it's described in a very interesting way. It says that the Egyptians ate in one room, the brothers ate in another room, and Joseph ate in a third room. Because it was an abomination for Egyptians to eat with Hebrew or Hebrews, or however they looked at these brothers, these nomads. And I've always been troubled by that. And oftentimes during Hanukkah, that's the focus of my sermon, because I think about what it means to be a minority and dealing with a majority culture, and thinking about what it means to be thought of as an abomination. And that's what I want to share as my tangent this morning, because I think that is an enormously powerful piece of Torah, and through it we can understand the slavery that comes not terribly long afterwards. Because when you look at somebody as an abomination, when you look at somebody as less than human, then then hatred can move to action, and action can move to things like slavery, murder, and the like. And we see that in our world today with Hamas. We see that in our world today as people from our own community use hate and delegitimize the other as an excuse to hate. And we see it in America as it leads to anti-Semitism. So it's something really to think about as we look at other human beings. It's important to remember we're all created B'Tselem Elokim, in the image of God. Aside number one. My main topic today, though, was thinking about Joseph. And I've actually never thought about Joseph in a particularly systematic way. I've read through the stories, I picked up pieces. But this year, as I was reading the Joseph cycle, I noticed something fascinating. Joseph and the whole cycle is unique for Genesis. I was thinking, as I was reading, of a format in Japan which is called the boku novel. Boku is a Japanese noun, or pronoun actually, which means I, but Japanese has lots of words for I. Watashi is what everybody uses. Watahai is what the emperor uses. Watakushi is what you use if you're talking to somebody very important and you're very lowly. And boku was only used by feckless young men. Although apparently today, many, many older men, even people my age, are using it. And women are beginning to use boku as well, because they say, there could be, although Japan is a very structured and gendered language in many ways, and with hierarchies, so women are often stuck with just watashi, which is just the basic I, which shows how people are looked at within the society. But the feckless man is the essence of many, many Japanese novels, where oftentimes the character won't even have a name, but it will be written boku, I, and then have the descriptions. And oftentimes, the novels move from this feckless youth all the way as the person grows, and by the end of the novel, they're not quite as feckless, but instead, they suffered, they've experienced life, and they now look at the world in a very different way. So, in looking at Joseph and the three Parshaot that deal with Joseph, last week, this week, and next week, I realized that I was in the middle of a boku novel. I realized that I was looking at a feckless youth who was growing up. It was a rags to riches story, yes, but it was also a story of growth, of aging, of someone who changes his outlook towards the world as he grows up. And if you think about it, there is hardly any other story like that in Genesis, let alone the rest of the Bible. Abraham pops out fully formed pretty much. Isaac and Jacob, pretty formed. Jacob wrestles, yes, but does he really change? Not so much. But Joseph is a fully formed character with more text written about him, really, than nearly any other character in the Bible. We really see Joseph in different stages of his life, and he's not the same person in each of the different stages of his life. So he starts out very much that boku, feckless youth. I have a dream, I dreamed that I saw you guys bowing down to me. Your seeds were bowing down to me. The sun and the moon and the stars were bowing down to me. Isn't that great? Without any thought about what would happen, without any thought of the reaction of his brothers, just going through life, very, very uncaring, in some ways passive, so things happen to him. His father gives him the coat. He saunters around, but it's father who does the action. His father sends him off to find his brothers. His father wasn't very wise, and Joseph just goes off. That's what dad wants. I'm going to do it. A happy-go-lucky kid of the world. And of course, getting put in the pit, getting sold to the Ishmaelites, we hear a lot from Joseph's brothers, but we don't hear a word from Joseph. And even as he gets sold to Potiphar in Egypt, again, we know that he does a great job, but he doesn't say anything. He's passive. He's silent as things happen to him. He is this feckless youth without much agency, not perhaps a terribly interesting character. But suddenly things begin to change. Joseph's put in jail, and suddenly while in jail, he excels again, but he also develops a voice, although it's not strong yet. He develops a voice so that when the baker and the butcher and the candlestick maker and all these people have when the butler and the baker have their dreams, Joseph is there and he says, I can explain them. He has that wisdom that is the divine wisdom similar to what we found in the Haftorah today, Solomon having the divine wisdom to judge, Joseph, among many things, having the divine wisdom to be able to interpret dreams. He dreamed at the beginning of the last week's Parsha. This week, he interprets dreams. Maybe that's a sign of growing up. I don't know. But he grows, but he's able to interpret them. But even though then, he's still a little bit passive because the baker is, of course, executed. The butler is back in town, but he doesn't say anything, and Joseph doesn't seem to speak. He doesn't say, what happened about me? Why didn't you remember me when you got back to Pharaoh? But then, of course, we see Joseph transformed as he becomes the Grand Vizier. He rightly interprets Pharaoh's dreams and helps Pharaoh to see how to solve the problems of Egypt. So we see Joseph now growing up. We see Joseph becoming a strong personality who's willing to shape the world rather than being shaped by the world. But we also see Joseph in thinking about his relationship with his brothers, and we see a growth process here too. What can you imagine what Joseph felt when he first saw his brothers when they came up to Egypt after so many years, having sold him to slavery? You can only imagine the anger that he felt, and we can feel it. Joseph says to them first, I'm going to let one of you go, but the rest of you are going to be in prison. And then he says, and then he puts them in jail for 3 days. And finally, he tests them by sending off the rest of them while keeping Shimon prisoner and demanding that Benjamin be brought down to Egypt. Joseph is furious. Joseph, yes, he's testing his brothers to see their mettle, but he also is angry. He doesn't have compassion and see their suffering. He only feels his hurt. And maybe that's not natural. But when Benjamin comes down, and finally, when Judah shows his courage in standing up for Benjamin after the test that we'll see at the beginning of next week's Parsha, then suddenly Joseph is turned to compassion and to forgiveness. And Joseph reveals himself and says, I am your brother Joseph. And he helps them to feel a little bit better about what they did. This is what God wanted. This was the mission that I was placed in the world to do. That's why I'm in Egypt. He tries to remove the blame from the brothers a little bit, but they realize that they've done wrong. And even towards the end of the life, they still are afraid of Joseph, even though Joseph has truly transformed. But we also can see something else interesting in the Joseph stories. We can see a break of a cycle. If we think of Abraham, if we think about Isaac, and we think about Jacob, yes, they were heroic in many ways, but they were also terrible parents. And there was a systematic idea of a little bit of what we might call abuse from generation to generation to generation. A very unhealthy favoritism shown from generation to generation to generation. And yet, as we'll see later in the Parshas next week and beyond, Joseph's two sons are very unlike that. Ephraim and Manasseh, according to the rabbis, always were loving brothers, and Joseph was a loving parent to both of them. He didn't show favoritism one or the other. And for that reason, the rabbis say, that's why we bless our children. May you be like Ephraim and Manasseh, and not like the 11 brothers of Joseph. Well, 10 of them at least. Benjamin doesn't have much character. We can see Joseph transforming the nature of parenting in our holy family as well, in our patriarchal family, transforming it from an unhealthy set of relationships to a model of a much more healthy set of relationships. So for me, this novel that we read, this Boku novel, this I novel of a feckless youth, we see this feckless youth transformed. We see him go through the trials and tribulations of life and end up as a better human being because of that. And I think that's true for our lives as well, that we're going to have good experiences and bad experiences, and how we look at and learn from our experiences and the kind of choices we make decide what kind of story we're going to be. Are we going to be the hero, or are we going to be the anti-hero of our own stories? And in our tradition, God is always looking for that right choice. God is always looking for us to transform ourselves. Joseph transformed himself. We can transform ourselves. We can make choices that can build a better future because of the experiences that we've had in our lives. In fact, in the Talmud it says that God waits even to the day of a person's death for their repentance. We need to make that choice a lot earlier, we should, and transform ourselves so we have the opportunity to transform the world as well. So Joseph's Boku novel can be all of our Boku novels. We can all use that wonderful pronoun and think about our lives and our moving through our lives and how we can transform as well. Now, I want to share one other tangent today because of the Haftarah. It's not often that we get to read this wonderful story about Solomon and his choice, or his choice to the women about cutting the baby in half. And that was always a very special story to me for a very odd reason, and one I think that helped to explain the very odd trajectory of my rabbinate. When I was about 11, we had that scholastic book list. Does everybody remember that? Yeah. It was always the best time of the school year when you got the list, because then you got to buy books. And my parents always thought we could, they never worried, so as many books as we wanted from the list, go and get them. Books were what we always could get. And when I was about 11, I got a book about Oka the judge. He was a wise judge in the Edo period of Japan, in the time of the shoguns, and his stories were very similar to the stories of Solomon. In fact, many people look at and see these stories as sort of global wisdom stories that were shared across many, many different societies. And so for me, Oka was this font of wisdom, and one that stories I still remember today, and I'm going to share one very quickly. According to the story, Oka was judging between a young man and a restaurant owner. The young man lived above the restaurant, and he was so poor as a student that he was a boku, no doubt, that all he could afford was a bowl of rice. But the restaurateur heard him say one day that my bowl of rice is so delicious every night because as I eat it, the smells come up from the restaurant and they make my rice taste delicious. So I am a rich man. So the restaurateur decided to sue the boy because he was stealing the smell. So he comes before Oka, and by the way, Oka also had the same case of the women and made the same decision as Solomon. So he seems also to have had divine wisdom as well. And Oka listens to the two sides, the young man talking about how poor he is and all he has is rice, and the man from the restaurant saying, he's stealing my smell. And finally Oka says, well, the young man is certainly very deserving. I have to find that, yes, indeed, the boy is stealing the smell from the restaurateur. And everybody was shocked. And the young man looked terrified because he was poor. He had nothing. All he could afford was his school fees. But Oka said, how much money do you have in your pocket? And he had a few yen coins. So he said, take them out. And the young man was terrified because if he gave this up, that was no more food, no more rent, nothing. He would be on the street. And Oka said to the boy, shake the coins in your hand. And he turns to the restaurateur and says, you have been paid. And the restaurateur's confused. And so Oka said, the payment for the smell of food is the shaking sound of the money. So for me, that was always Solomon at his best. It captured the wisdom of the Haftarah. And I suspect it's probably a half to 2/3 of the reason why I was really excited about moving to Japan. Shabbat Shalom.